But let's start at the top. Marvin Harrison Jr. Again, I think we talked about it yesterday. He'll be our top wide receiver on the draft board. I think he'll be many analysts' top receiver on the draft board. Where's the best fit for Marvin Harrison Jr.? And let's also put the caveats in place. There might be some crossover with some similar teams here.
Right. No, so throughout this whole exercise, we'd love to hear from people in the chat. We'd love to hear from people in the comments of where you think that these guys' best case scenario would be, best landing spots. And the way that we kind of framed it was, what is their best landing spot for instant success? So it's got a little bit of a fantasy football feel to it as well. Where could these guys get drafted where we could see them have really, really good rookie years, potentially compete for a rookie of the year honor, if you will. For Marvin Harrison Jr., it's the Chargers. And I think it's the Chargers for all three of the big three, both him, Rome Odunze, and Malik Nabers. Now, I have some other teams for both of those guys because I didn't want to just totally cop out and say, oh, yeah, the Chargers for all of them. But in reality, that's going to be the best landing spot for all three of these guys. The Chargers pick currently at number 5 overall. That is still in range for Marvin Harrison Jr., even though the Patriots could end up selecting him at number 3. The Cardinals could certainly end up selecting him at number 4. But the Chargers are the best spot, right? They have a quarterback who is a top 10 quarterback of the NFL, whether you want to call him top 5 or not. That's a debate, I think, for another show and another day. But Justin Herbert is fully capable of being a passing machine to Marvin Harrison Jr. And I think that if he goes to the Chargers, even with Keenan Allen there, I don't know if Mike Williams is going to be there next year just because his contract, he can get out of it pretty easily. He's been banged up, obviously. He'd be the immediate wide receiver 2, if not the wide receiver 1, depending on how much volume Keenan Allen would get next year. And he'd be a 1,000-yard guy. So to me, this is easily the best landing spot given the quarterback situation is already in place and it's guy with all the arm talent in the world to maximize everything that MHJ can bring to the table.
Yeah, I think when I'm thinking about pairing QBs and receivers, I think about QB style, and I also think about what the receiver extracts out of the quarterback. So I think about Henry Ruggs a couple years ago with the Raiders. I wouldn't have taken him as the top receiver over a guy like CeeDee Lamb or other guys that were in the draft that year. But when he went to the Raiders, Derek Carr became more aggressive because they had a deep threat, and they almost kind of like induced aggressiveness out of him. Mm-hmm. I want one of those guys for Justin Herbert. And I'm not, and I want a good all-around guy like a Marvin Harrison, but now I'm thinking like later in the draft, a Xavier Worthy, or, if they don't take a receiver at the top, can we get a speed receiver or someone that's going to make Justin Herbert throw the ball down the field more? First priority, though, is just a very good receiver, and I think that's Marvin Harrison. He'll line up all over the place. He can win inside, outside, down the field, after the catch. Everything would be good if him and Justin Herbert are paired together, in my opinion.
Yeah, and kind of to your point, that's why the other two make sense as well. It's not just the fact that they're really good wide receivers, but you saw what Malik Nabers was able to do vertically, especially from a slot alignment. I think as the season went on, LSU really started to hit a groove with that slot fade route that Jaden Daniels was just very, very comfortable throwing, whether it was from 20 yards out, 30 yards out, 40 yards out, however furthest the distance was from the end zone. Daniels was not afraid of dropping back and hitting that route for a touchdown, even to the point where like his feet may have been standing on the logo or near the 50-yard line. So there's tons of vertical experience with Nabers. He's got great after the catch ability as well. So I think that is a good plug and play option to, like you said, induce some aggressiveness into that offense. Or I don't want to say, because it's not like the Derek Carr situation. It's not like Justin Herbert won't throw it deep. You just then have a guy which you could do that more often. And the same for Odunze, right? Odunze is 6'3", 215 pounds. He's a bigger receiver, but he's got a high average depth of target. I mean, you look at the last 2 years of Washington's air raid offensive system, Michael Penix is just letting it fly. And Odunze was on the receiving end of a lot of those passes. So that could absolutely still be his bread and butter at the NFL level. So it's not just the fact that these are 3 really good wide receivers. They'd be great to pair with Justin Herbert. I agree with you. All 3 of them, to me, give you that sort of what is missing from the Chargers offense right now. And it is that constant deep threat. And that is that electric playmaker deep down the field.
Let's talk about that top 3 then as a group. Yesterday we went a little out of order at times and probably confused people, but the way you have the list here, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, do you think this ends up becoming pretty consensus, or is this going to be pretty consensus across the NFL from an evaluation standpoint? These are the top three, and then there's a drop off. How do you stack up this class first? And by the way, quick teaser too. I think Sam and I are going to unveil our wide receiver rankings next week. So we have yours on PFF.com as part of our draft board. You're going to continue to update that leading up to the draft. But is this a clear top three? Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze?
Yes, I think so. It's a very clear top three to me. Now, consensus, the word consensus gets a little bit tricky because I do think that opinions are going to vary quite a bit. I don't think
Let's
we're
say
going to
most common.
That's probably the way that I would say it. Like I think at the end of the process, some people are going to have Malik Neighbors wide receiver 3. Some are going to have him wide receiver 2. Some are going to have him wide receiver 1. The same thing I think maybe could be the case with Rome Odunze. But at the end of the day, when we get to draft day, the end of April, the most common spots for all three of these guys, in my opinion, is going to be Harrison Jr. at 1, Malik Neighbors at 2, Rome Odunze at 3. I think that will be the most common amongst them. So I don't really see anybody else making a run at one of those top 3 spots. You'll just kind of see them play musical chairs a little bit. But that is, to me, the most common outcome for those guys.
Yeah, most common is a good way to put it. I mean, I made the comment yesterday. We live in a world where, no offense to like Johnny Twitter user who has 300 followers. I'm not trying to denigrate him at all. But that guy has his own draft board now, right? And he like those guys send us their draft boards all the time, just whoever, because it's fun and people like to do that. So if you say, "Oh, everybody's got these in the top 3," somebody will jump in and be like, "No, I got this guy 7th on my draft board. Here's the link to my, Angel Fire website or whatever it is." Again, no offense. I'm just saying
what is Angel Fire?
Something from the late 90s. Don't worry about it. It's way back. My references are starting to get dated right now.
I was gonna say, man, I remember making a website on like Weebly. You remember doing that? Like I would do no? Oh man, so that was like early 2010s. I made my own draft website in 2011. Called it Road to Radio City. That's when the draft was still hosted in Radio City Music Hall in New York City every single year. So I called it Road to Radio City, and it was just, it was a draft website. It was a cool way for me to kind of, customize how the rankings looked and the feature images and how their website looked and all the articles and stuff like that. But that was a Weebly or WordPress website. I don't even know what you said.
This is well before.
Yeah, I don't even know what you said.
I mean, who hasn't had a draft website? I had drafthub.com.
There we go, baby.
For a year in 2012. So again, the point I'm trying to make is not to denigrate anyone that's doing that. That's fun. That's awesome. It's just funny when you make a statement, the consensus or everyone does this or whatever. There's always someone with a differing opinion because there's just far more opinions and easier to share them.
Sure.
So when I use the word consensus, I'm thinking majority mostly. Any other landing spots for Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, or Fitz that makes sense for you?
Yeah. So obviously, if the Bears go quarterback at number 1, then both Neighbors and Odunze are in play to have really, really productive seasons if they go to the Bears at number 9. So I think the Bears are an option if they go quarterback at number 1. Obviously, if they don't, if Fields is still the quarterback, or basically if they're bringing in anybody other than Kirk, like I'm just throwing out all the different scenarios. And shoot, I mean, maybe if it even is Kirk Cousins, I still think that the rest of the offense would need a little bit of work. They probably wouldn't be the answer. But if it's Caleb Williams, I think that's the answer because Caleb is coming from a heavy passing system. He's just going to let it fly. Like this is somebody who I think even in his rookie season is going to be pretty fearless as a passer. So Chicago becomes a team in play for those. I like both Neighbors and Odunze for the Cardinals, although I would say I feel like I gravitate towards Neighbors in Arizona being a more productive player just because I feel like his speed and style with the other guys that are in there right now, I think they could lose Marquise Brown in free agency. I'm not so sure that he's going to come back. I'm not so sure they're going to want to pay his price tag. So all of a sudden that speed element could immediately still be in the offense and more if you're drafting a guy like Neighbors, which they saw some good connection with that at the tail end of the Cardinals season last year when Kyler Murray was able to come back and be healthy. So a fully healthy year from Kyler Murray. Didn't want to brush that off as we talked about the Chargers being a good landing spot. I think that Neighbors would be really great in Arizona. And then Odunze, honestly, this is a perfect fit for him. The New York Jets. The Jets are sitting there at number 10, and we consistently say offensive line, offensive line, offensive line. And I think at the end of the day, it is offensive line. But outside of Garrett Wilson, they desperately need wide receiver production as well. So for Odunze to go in an offense where he becomes a 1-2 with Garrett Wilson, and then Aaron Rodgers is throwing him the football. You got Breece Hall coming out of the backfield. Hopefully the offensive line's a lot better. That also could manifest itself in a 1,000-yard season for Odunze. So to me, I think if we're not going with Chicago for both of those other two guys, I like the Cardinals' fit, especially as a Marquise Brown replacement for Neighbors. And then I love Odunze getting to play with Aaron Rodgers in New York for the Jets potentially at the back end of the top 10.
I think we painted that picture a little bit yesterday with the Jets. If they went with the strategy of we're going to shore up the offensive line in free agency, fill our starting spots there, we might not have to take a tackle at 10. And then, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, think about Odunze and his highlight reel. It is the vertical route tree. Michael Penix's biggest strength, throwing the ball outside the numbers with velocity, throwing the ball head high on back shoulders and throwing a fade ball off of that. Think about Rodgers in that vertical passing tree and what he'd be able to do with Odunze. If Garrett Wilson is his high volume receiver and Odunze becomes more of that vertical back shoulder type of threat, I do love that fit as well. The Jets again they'd have to have the offensive line in place, I think, for them to go receiver in the first round. And Odunze might not even be there at that point at 10.
Right.
There was also a point for Odunze in particular earlier in the offseason where I was thinking, I didn't think that he would be in the top 10 conversation initially. And I was thinking the Cincinnati Bengals, if they're going to, even if they bring back T. Higgins as a franchise tag, I thought Odunze would be an awesome fit as the future number 2, or if they let Higgins completely walk. But I don't think he ends up in the middle of the first round. So that point might be moot at this point. But that was my initial take.
No, I think that's a great one as well. And we'll get to this team in a little bit, but if Neighbors were to have a fall much further than what we believe he's going to, I think the Colts sitting there at 15, if he's within striking range, the Colts wanted to move up, or if somehow, some way he got to 15 and was still on the board, that's also perfect for me because you got Pippen as an X on the line of scrimmage wide receiver. You've got Josh Downs as a slot stud for you. You can have a elite flanker or move wide receiver in Neighbors who could just be such a chess piece in whatever you wanted to do. And obviously Richardson's got a cannon of an arm. So we'll talk about Indianapolis, but if you're saying, okay, teams a little bit further down that would also be ideal landing spots, Indianapolis would be one for Neighbors.